You read the title right. Today we're about to review the best ball gown tutorial ever. We're going to be using our handy Draping the Complete course book. Here I'm going to take you through step by step on how to create a full voluminous giant ball gown, the steps you need, the materials you need, the layers. So definitely I would watch this video once through just so you understood what you had to do, and then just break it up as you go along so that we can learn exactly what it takes to make those full voluminous ball gowns that we see. And for those of us who sew or are sewing enthusiasts, want to know, like, how do you make those gowns? How do you get those giant ball gowns? What does it take? So that's what we're about to do. Let's get started. So as usual, we're definitely going to need our ruler. We use that for almost all of our pieces. We're going to use our scissors. We're actually going to use draping tape here. I have style tape. We're actually going to use draping tape for this project, and I'll show you what that is. Our magnetic pin holder, that's always coming in handy for us when we do these projects. And we're also going to need the actual pins itself, whatever kinds of pins you like to use, draping pins, drafting pins. You don't necessarily need the elastic tape. I'm going to show you some other techniques that you can use instead of using the elastic tape, but it's good to have. Obviously, you're always going to need that pen and that pencil just for truing and marking our fabric. So let's go on to our next steps. Now we need to know exactly what it is, the materials we're going to need. The full tutorial of this with all the instructions, the measurements for both full scale and half scale, it is in a PDF in my website or on my Etsy shop. You can go to those links in the description and it'll give you the full breakdown. The first two pieces were the yokes, front and back. This next piece is going to be the front of the skirt. So this is also going to be a front and a back, and here you see some of the lines. Again, the full measurements for all these lines will be in that PDF. So if you want the full measurements, you're going to have to go to the Etsy shop or to my website to get those full measurements, okay? Here is another piece of muslin, and this is going to be your back piece. And this is just me showing you that. Next, you're going to need your first petticoat pieces. So this is the front and the back of a petticoat. And again, all those measurements will be in that PDF. Next, you're going to need some organza. You can do whatever color you want to do based on your project. It's really up to you. So you're going to need organza front and back pieces. This is a half scale, and I'm only doing half of the project. So all these measurements will need to be doubled in order for you to do a full dress. Here is some pieces of tulle. You're going to need a lot of tulle, bolts and bolts and bolts of it if you're going to make this a full scale. This is how much tulle I use for half scale, and it was still quite a bit of tulle. I'm also going to use a different color tulle because you're going to see that we're going to be doing 2 layers of tulle. So just for some contrast, I have just an additional layer of tulle. If you're doing this for like your actual dress, then you really decide on the color tulle and how much tulle you need exactly. Okay, we're also going to need horsehair braid because my dress form is a half scale form. I'm only using this 1-inch tulle. If you're doing a full scale, you're going to need about 3 to 4 inches of some stiff plastic tulle. And lastly, I have just some dressing glitter tulle to just lay over the top layer. Traditionally, if you were doing a full scale dress, you probably would need like taffeta or satin or silk in addition to the tulle. Okay, so now we're going to actually get started on drafting our actual piece. I'm going to go with that front yoke, and as usual, we're going to line up the center front with the center front of the dress form. I'm also going to smooth out the sides, and for this one we're going to create a slight dart near the princess seam. So we're going to create a really soft dart for this yoke. You may choose not to have this yoke piece on your actual ball gown. You may decide to just go fully from the waist out. Just for the sake of this tutorial, I am doing a yoke first, and this is just me pinning the yoke in place as well as creating that soft dart for us to get started and working with, and just smoothing everything out. So now we're going to use that drafting or draping tape that I was talking about. I bought this from Amazon. It's really thin and it's great for when you're creating different kinds of designs, just to make sure that you have really symmetrical, neat and easy lines. So I'm going to be using this to create sort of this swooping effect that the yoke is going to have. It may not be perfect. You can always go back and, you know, just like mess with it a little bit. This is like a first try, and yep, I'm pretty happy with this result. And this is what's going to be sort of my guiding line for the hem of this yoke. So now I'm going to go in and mark my waist area with a pencil and just lightly mark the waist area as well as the side seams. And as usual, when we are coming along a curve, we want to make sure that we snip those areas so that way we can give the curve some room to fall naturally, nicely, and neatly. Whatever we do to the front of our mannequin dress form, we do to the back of it. So this is just me taking similar steps that I took in the front to the back of the dress form. Now we're going to take our first front panel and we're going to lay it on top of that draping tape line that we created. And we're just going to line everything up and measure it nicely so that everything is nice and even. So here's a close-up. So I'm using the line that I created with the front panel and I'm lining it up with the very bottom of the draping tape. And I'm just going to use that line as a guide, as well as the draping tape as a guide, as I'm sort of cinching this together to create this rouge fullness pattern that I have. I'm going to show you some other techniques on how I gather my fabric when I'm doing skirts. I know we can use a machine stitch, but I can just show you my own techniques. You do what makes you feel comfortable. For the sake of this video, I'm just sort of like showing you how it should look when it's done. It should have this gathered look, and you're going to be using those lines to correspond with each other to create the outcome that you see here. So here you see that I have sort of this line going up and I have all my pins going this way, and I have this sort of gathered effect that I'm going to create. So this is what yours should look like with the pins. Now we're going to do the same thing to the back. So this is what it looks like when we've taken that first step that we did a few minutes ago and we've just replicated it to the back. This is what you have. I've also taken my pins and created a side seam. If you want to help yourself out, you make sure the pins go diagonal from the actual closure. Here I'm just cutting off the excess that I have here at the top and just leaving that bit of fabric at the top here. I know you're wondering, all right, how do you remove this from your actual dress form? You can see I'm just carefully removing each pin and then replacing it with a slanted or diagonal pin to make sure that each tuck stays in place as I'm removing it. And I'm just going through that very gently, making sure that each pin gets replaced with the corresponding pin so that the tucks stay in place. And then that's what it basically looks like. You can go ahead and machine stitch that down, or you can hand sew it down to make sure everything stays in place. So now we're going to go back to our yoke and create a definitive line. So I do a little bit of a seam allowance, probably like 1/4 of an inch. You might want to do a 1/2 inch for your full scale dress form. And I just go right below the draft line and take some of that excess off there. And yep, I use my scissors to cut right along the draft line that I created, not on it, because I do want to create some seam allowance. So I just go right below it and just cut along that line that I created after I remove the draping tape, because I already have the line that I'm going to be using. So I just go along there and I just cut the excess off. From that line, I go up about a 1/2 inch, and then I mark from the bottom up. So from the hem of the yoke, I just mark up about a 1/2 inch, and you'll see why I've done that. So I go in and I'm ready to fold this under. But before I fold it under, I'm going to need to clip those edges. Again, we always need to do that to make sure that when we're coming across those curves, that we give that curve enough space to lie flat. Remember this piece? Yes, we're going to go and take this piece and place it underneath the yoke. So we're just going to gently, this does take some manipulation, some maneuvering. It does take a bit of time. It's a little easier probably on a full scale form. You have more control, but this is what it looks like when it's done. So here I've basically pinned everything down right underneath the yoke, and this is what I have. So you can see my full yoke, and you can see that first layer of the skirt. I have my diagonal pins. I've done it to the front and back. Now we need to make our hem. It doesn't have to be fancy. If this is going to be your actual dress, I do recommend you taking the appropriate measurements for the individual wearing it, waist to floor measurements. If you're doing it in heels, make sure they have the heels on when you're doing this. For the sake of this particular tutorial, I'm just going to go to the edge of the actual mannequin because this is just for demonstration. Again, if you're doing it on a client, on yourself, you want to make sure you get the accurate measurements because this is going to be the base of your dress. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We have our hem cut, we have our yoke. Now we move on to the next step. Now we're going to be adding our horsehair braid. Again, I'm going to be using a 1-inch horsehair braid. You use based on how wide, how full you want it to be. If you don't have an exact tutorial on how to put on a horsehair braid, I do have a video on that. This is just going to be a quick review. So I go to the right side of the fabric and I place my horsehair on the very edge. I always pin and I always hand sew to make sure that the horsehair braid stays in place. You want to do that all around. Once you're done, it looks a little bit something like this. Then you're going to take that, flip it under, and then you're going to pin again. Again, I always hand sew and do everything first before I run it through the machine because horsehair braid has the tendency, in my opinion, to move and to twist. So once you've got that, this is what you should have. You can top stitch that, or you can stitch it at the bottom. Some people do it in both places, some people do it in one place. This is what it looks like. So now you see that hem is nice and full. Now we're going to add our petticoat. Okay, so this is the part of the dress form where we're going to be starting to attach our layers to get that fullness. This was the base. Now we're going to be adding that petticoat. Here the measurements get a little loosey-goosey. For my measurements for this, I did about 2 inches down. If you're doing a full scale, I would say 3 to 4 inches down, like right below the hip line. Okay. And again, here I'm going to be attaching it with that initial anchor pin just to get it down. And I'm going to be rouging it right just below that hip line. Rouging it, doing the same thing that I've done from the front to the back. Now you can do this here where I'm just sort of like pinning it together and just like eyeballing it and then using those pins to attach it. That's one way to do it. Here's another way. Use a basting stitch by hand and you just baste it using this very long basting needle, and then what I do is I just pull it. I prefer this technique to do it by hand versus doing it on the machine. Sometimes the machine stitches to me, even at a 0.5, are too tight. They snap, they don't pull properly. Hand stitching is tedious, it's longer, but to me it gives me the most control and it's the most accurate. So when I'm even making my full scale dresses, I still hand sew all the layers when I'm doing ruching. It's totally up to you. I just feel better about it. It gives me more control. So I basically take this technique and I use it throughout the entirety of the petticoat. I go with my scissors and I just make sure that the hems are nice and even. You can decide to add an additional horsehair braid if you want more fullness. I'm not going to. This is where things get really tedious, really boring, but also really beautiful. Now you're going to start working with your tulle. Usually for the tulle, you need tons and tons and tons of layers, tons and tons of tulle. I'm going to say 200-300 yards. And I usually cut them, for the sake of this, I believe this was like 3 inches. Usually for tulle, you're talking about 5 or 6 inches, and it should be folded in half. Just for each row. You're going to need tons of it, especially for a full figured dress form. You do the same technique if you choose. You can also use the machine, like I said, to do this gathering. I'm using the hand, I basically take these layers and I just repeat over and over and over until I get about 3 rows. So here you can see I've done my rouging and I've attached it bottom row first, second row, third row, top row. Okay, next is the organza. So you're going to take your organza and you're going to place it on top of these tulle rolls that you have created. You can already see the body starting to come together. And you use the same method that you've been using, this sort of gathering method. You can use the machine or you can use your hand. So you're going to do a piece for the front and the piece for the back. Here's my technique for organza because it gets everywhere. I usually just be very cautious with this, just gently take a lighter and just like singe the tips. That way there's not so much fraying. Be gentle with this. It does burn very quickly, but it makes it a lot easier to manage. Okay, so this is my organza. I put it on the front and the back of it, and this is just me showing you how I use that gathering technique to put my organza on there to create the fullness in the dress. And you guessed it, more tulle. So we're going to add more tulle and we're going to repeat the same steps we did a while back before we put the organza on. We're going to do some rouging and we're going to add some layers to the top and the bottom. You can decide to do the middle, it's up to you, but I'm going to do the top and the bottom. You have to be very careful with this. It gets very tedious because you have to really get inside those layers. You don't want to lay it directly on top because it'll bunch it. You want to make sure you spread the fabric out as you're adding the tulle layers to it. And this is what it looks like. So this is a few layers, but you can clearly see the ball gown coming in place. And the final layer of this tutorial, I decided to use some glitter tulle. You probably want to use a stiffer fabric and have the glitter tulle just be an accent. I just did it for the sake of this video, but you use the same method that you've been using. You want to do that gathering and add it to the front and the back. Our finale, you're just going to cut it so it's nice and even at the hem, and we are all done. Best ball gown tutorial ever. What did you enjoy most about this project? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, make like a lady.